Okay, so let's get going. So there's going to be quite a lot of. So I'm going to put some. We're going to put some slides up, and we're going to be talking through some things, and then we're going to narrow down a very specific conversational pattern or conversational practice. And just so you know, Antoinette and I are in the process of putting together events, programs, workshops, whatever you want to call it, clinics, all of which are related to conversational practices. We feel that, in order to create environments that enhance our capacity for inner agility, the primary vehicle for doing that is conversation, relationship, and communication. So that's really a big deal for us. So look for more of these webinars like today in the future. Okay, so let me just, without any further ado, I'll share my screen. Okay. All right, so the official name of this webinar is Better Collective Sensemaking. Evernote, of course, always wants me to, better collective decision-making through sense-making intelligence. Probably a more apt title is Conversational Traps and How to Unset Them. So the inference being that once you're in a trap, you're kind of stuck. And but you can unset these traps, and that's really a big part of what this is session's about today. Cool. And Michael Hammond here, and Antoinette, you want to teach people how to pronounce your name?
Antoinette Kutsia.
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 Okay. Good. So let's just set the stage here. So kind of one of the premises of our work is that the sort of the molecular, the lowest level particle in organizations in a VUCA world, in a 21st century world, it's not individuals, it's actually relationships. And most of what we do in organizations is what we do with others. So the primary medium in our work with others is conversation, even internal conversation. So you could say more broadly that the primary medium is a linguistic medium, but since today is about conversations, we're going to kind of narrow it down specifically to conversation. But know that for us, that the linguistic realm is the primary realm in which transformation can happen. And in today's session, that part of the linguistic realm we're going to be diving into is conversation, dialogue. Okay, so given all of that, have you noticed, right? Have you noticed that your conversations often go around in circles? See head nods. By the way, that doesn't seem to go away. I think I'm pretty masterful at this, and Antoinette, you may say the same thing, but I'm telling you, it's absolutely shocking how unskillful I am. I'm pretty skillful, but when the rubber meets the road, sometimes I'm just so not skillful. We become immobilized when conflict arises. We become kind of stupid as collectives. So this is again as collectives. The solutions we come up with often don't generate the expected impact. So we think we have a great idea collectively, but it doesn't generate the results that we hope for. Can people relate to these? Raise your hand if you can relate to this. Like our collective intelligence becomes far less than our individual intelligence. So we often say that that a camel is a horse designed by a committee, and I always feel sorry for the camel. I happen to like camels, so you could say that the horse is a camel designed by a committee, but you get the idea that things just go awry. And so we want to just take a little bit of time here to kind of understand what's going on, or to not necessarily understand, but to kind of start to unpack it a little bit. And there's lots of ways that we could unpack it. And the way that we're going to unpack it today is in relation to like lack of transparency, the whole question of transparency, that you could say that one of the underlying conditions is the underlying operating system capabilities that's missing in many of our conversations is transparency. And so we want to say what we mean by transparency here, and then we want to do a little bit of work in how we can enhance and create greater transparency. Cool. Okay, so what do we mean by lack of transparency? So we don't say what we think. So, and as we go through these, look for yourself, look in recent conversations, where you don't say what you think. You have a thought about something or somebody, but you don't say it. And there's all kinds of reasons why we don't. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good, but this is so. We don't openly reveal our assumptions. And often we're not even aware of our assumptions. We're so into the heat of our reactive engagement in the moment that we just don't even notice what assumptions might be there in the background. There are culturally held assumptions that are there in the culture, of which we're really, not aware. I mean, jokes work because they play off of assumptions, off of people's assumptions. So, so that's one kind of source for our one aspect of our lack of transparency. We avoid uncomfortable feelings, mainly embarrassment. I mean, how many times have we been sitting in a meeting or a conversation and the stakes feel a little high and we don't want to say something, and the main thing that keeps our mouth shut is our fear of being embarrassed? I mean, it's kind of silly when you think about it from the comfort of your chair while you're sipping some tea and listening to whatever music you like to listen to. I mean, of course I can deal with being embarrassed, but for the most part, we don't, especially in the heat of the moment.
There are also sometimes things around this discomfort. We don't want to make other people feel discomfort.
Yes.
We avoid. We don't want to feel like we are putting a stick in the wheel for others. So we're slowing down the process, or whether we feel, well, I don't want to be seen as negative. I don't want to cast a negative vibe, in this conversation. So it's sometimes for our own, to avoid our own uncomfortable feelings, but very often, especially if there's a good rapport and good relationships with those that we are in conversation with, it's also to avoid discomfort for them.
Yeah. But keep an eye on that, because there's an interesting irony, because we say we have good rapport, so I don't want to say something to disrupt that rapport. So how deep is that rapport if it's something that could be upset by my saying something frankly and openly and transparently? And so I can't remember the Shakespeare phrase, something about, the things we weave. I can't remember. Maybe Olaf remembers what the phrase is. But whatever it is that we weave,
And first we practice to deceive. Something we can't remember it. What we when first we practice to deceive.
Yeah, and we don't think that we're deceiving. We don't realize. We don't recognize it. It's so embedded in the culture. It's literally like the water that we swim in. All of these things. We assume that if I say something to somebody about something, that it's going to hurt them. That's another one of those assumptions. It may not. It might actually really contribute to them. but we don't check our assumptions. And so we're gonna come back to that in just a moment, right? Certain practices to help untrap us. We don't really hear what others say. We hear what we think we say. We hear what we interpret. In fact, for the most part, we don't really sense what's going on. We don't interact with what's going on. We interact with what we make up. And much of what we make up gets made up, and we're completely unaware that it's getting made up, but something's making it up. But those are our filters. And yes, it's nice to be able to say something about our filters, but we're in the heat of the moment, we don't notice it. And there are probably many others, aren't there, Antoinette, that we could add to this. Didn't want to overwhelm people, really. But you get the feeling, you get the gist of it, right? There's the certain spirit that's present with the lack of transparency. So I guess you could kind of say that transparency is hard, but it's very confronting, isn't it? Like if you think of really being open and transparent in those moments where it feels dicey, it's really uncomfortable. So what we do is that we get really good at opacity, however you pronounce that, right? We get really good at it. And in fact, you could say that we're master craftsmen in the art and practice of opacity, especially in today's organizations. I mean, we're really good at it. You know, like we we cover up our mistakes. We engage with others to cover up their mistakes. Then we cover up that we're covering up. And we're really deft at that. We've become very skillful. To be a professional in today's world is to be really skillful at this stuff. And Chris Argyris wrote, I can't remember if it was a book or an article, a really kind of devastating indictment of the consulting industry. And what he found is that the people who are the most skillful at opacity, and he uses the word skillful in the purely ironic sense of the term, are the professionals. The more professionally trained you are, the better you are at this. The better you are at, you know, kind of keeping things non-transparent. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. Okay, so that very skillfulness is what creates collaborative traps. And they're collaborative in the sense that we collaboratively engaged in the setting of those traps. And we collaboratively engage in stepping into those traps. Because the alternative is unknown. We don't know, because we've never really tried it. Except in moments of, you know, when we lose our head and when we're in love, you know, the fresh bloom of new love. We may become a little more transparent, perhaps. So the monkeys and the ladder. Probably, I'm not sure that there's anybody who hasn't seen this, but just to kind of refresh our memories. So the thing here is that you've got 5 or 8 monkeys, however many it is, and there's a ladder and the banana is going up. And what happens is when one monkey goes up to try to get the bananas, cold water is sprayed on the rest of the monkeys. And that happens repeatedly until at some point the monkeys realize that if somebody goes up the ladder to get the bananas, they're going to get sprayed with cold water. So then whenever a monkey tries to do it, they beat him up. Until after a while, the whole culture of monkeys has been well trained. Even though that tantalizing bananas up there, we're not going to go up and get them. Now, what happens is if they take a monkey, one of those monkeys out and they put another one in, right? And that monkey's just come in. It's just, God, everyone's just sitting around. There's those great bananas up there. I'm going to go up and get one. And they all pounce upon him or her. and then that's it. And he or she won't do that. Now, one difference between monkeys and human beings is that human beings will not go up the ladder, not having had the personal experience of getting beaten up. They can just feel that going up the ladder is not a good idea, so they won't. So human beings don't even have to be beat up. Monkeys are a little smarter in a certain way than us. Anyway, so we call them collaborative traps because we all work together to guarantee they stay in place. Okay, so, but we're not monkeys. Thank goodness, or I don't know, but we're not monkeys. So, and by that, we can say that there are specific conversational moves that help us break free of these traps. And there's just a tremendous wealth of research and work done in the study and investigation of conversational practices that help us be more productive, however we want to define it. And so we want to just look at one particular move, and this comes from the world of structural dynamics, and it's called a bystand. Now, as you'll see in a moment, we're treating it a little bit loosely in terms of structural dynamics, but not terribly so. I personally like the word bystand because it signifies that I am standing outside and watching, but I'm not involved, right? And so, and a bystand is a conversational move that can happen in any conversation. Anytime someone is moved to step outside of the tangle of the conversation, to step outside and be able to offer observations on what we're seeing from that point of bystanding. So we want to just unpack this a little bit, and so what we mean by bystand. So bystand works in the following way. Most of the time when we're in a conversation, again, especially when the stakes are somewhat high, our attention is primarily in the content of the conversation. Like right now, we're all engaged in the content of this mostly one-way conversation we're having now, but we're all absorbed in the content, and at the same time, so there's the content, right? What we're talking about, what the topic is, what's the data, what's the what are we doing, and what are we up to and why, and all that kind of stuff. So all of that is the content of the conversation. And meanwhile, there is always a process. There's also a context of the conversation, but we're not going to get into that today. So, but there's certainly a process. The process refers to, the ways in which we go about our conversations. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. So now what a bystand does is that it steps away from the content in order to bring even just a momentary focus on the process. So that's what a bystand is to step outside of absorption in the content in order to offer maybe an observation, maybe an insight as it relates to the process, because our ability to skillfully and competently deal with content is always going to be determined by our process. If our process is poor, to use a term, then our ability to generate results is going to be poor. It's just, just how it is. Okay, so what a bystand calls attention to? It calls attention to our interaction patterns. Like for instance, in this conversation right now, there's very little, the interaction pattern is me and Antoinette talking and you're listening, right? So, so that's an interaction pattern. Interaction patterns include things like who talks the most, who talks the least, who isn't talking at all. Who talks, like, so certain patterns like person A talks, and when person A talks, the chances of person C talking afterwards is greater than if person B talks. So these are all patterns that help us increase our awareness of what's going on. So these are interaction patterns.
There's a whole lot more in terms of what are the moves that we make. You know, are we coming up with one idea after the other? Are we coming up with one idea and then there is just a debate about that idea? Are we coming up with one idea and then everybody just says yes, sir, no, sir, three bags full, sir? So all of those are play into action patterns as well.
Yeah. There's the prevailing mood. Wow, I noticed there's a kind of, this conversation has taken on a certain mood of somberness or joy, you know, or whatever it is, right? But to be able to call out the mood, because again, when we're wrapped up in the content, we just don't notice it. And all of these things affect our competence in dealing with whatever it is we're dealing with in the realm of content. By the way, we're not here to advocate that you should get rid of content and just focus on process, right? I mean, some people suggest that, but that's not what we're talking about here. That we're really, it's about enabling us to be able to deal with content more effectively and competently. What we seem to be avoiding, you know, so sometimes we say, you know, like what's the elephant in the room? What is it that's, you know, we're avoiding talking about? Maybe somebody on our team is just not pulling their weight, and then nobody's saying anything. So calling attention to something we may be avoiding. Hidden assumptions or beliefs. You know, what might be, you know, we seem to be wrapped around the axle on something. What might be the assumption that's keeping us somewhat stuck? Sometimes these can be posed as questions. This is not about derailing the conversation. This is not about like turning the conversation into a focus on process. This is kind of like we're in the content. Okay, now somebody will feel inspired to move toward a bystander and say something or bring attention to the process. We might discuss that for a moment to see if there's some way that we can improve the process. And by the way, that kind of activity grows a team's ability. They just tend to get, when they do that, the more they do that, the better they get at managing the process aspects of the conversation, and they don't necessarily need to step outside quite as much. Okay. So a simple bystanding pattern. We're going to do some work with this actually, and you're going to do some work in just a moment. What are we doing for time? Okay, we seem to be doing pretty well. Okay, a simple bystanding pattern. Okay, so this is one way to kind of render this pattern. So the first thing is to call attention to what's happening, and we want to not just say so-and-so interrupts all the time, right? That's a kind of it's a bit of an interpretation, right? So you might want to say, so what seems to be happening is that, or what is happening is that whenever person A speaks, frequently person B will come in and interrupt. You know, and and the more that you can illustrate this and give examples of this, the greater the degree of transparency that it invites. Because if I give examples, so when I say what's happening, it's a form of advocacy. I'm advocating something, I'm saying something is true, right? But I have to provide evidence. And when I provide evidence, what that does is it allows another person to potentially, what's the word? To counter my advocacy, to offer a different perspective. But if I don't provide any examples, then it's just my word against everybody else's. And it has the effect again of resetting that trap. Because then people are then they have to do a lot of maneuvering to try to get in there. Hello, Stephen. Good to see you. Good. So the second part of this pattern is, so I say what's happening. And we're going to give you a couple of examples in just a moment. Then I want to say what my experience is. So such and such is happening. And what I'm experiencing is, whatever your experience is. So we're providing information. We're providing information on what we're seeing and also how we experience that, or what feeling it evokes for us. What I make up about what's happening is the third part of this move, right? Sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, I have a story. I might have a story about Olaf. And I make up all kinds of stories about Olaf. Don't worry, Olaf, we're good. And well, whatever stories I make up about you, Olaf, are good ones, right? But so we have these stories, and so it's useful to say what I make up about that. That I have some sort of a story or some kind of an interpretation. And then finally, what then do I do, or what do I conclude? And then finally, we want to explicitly invite another perspective. So we're going to give a couple of examples of this, and then you're going to do a bit more work with this. And we can talk through this a little more completely as we go through the examples. Okay. Okay, so we're going to use the example of bystanding with a team. All right, so this is just an example of what this bystand. So this is somebody who the team is wrapped up in the content, and this is somebody on the team. By the way, this doesn't have to be a facilitator. These are things that team members ought to learn how to do. Our assertion is that these are among the kinds of skills that teams in a VUCA 21st century world need to be able to do. And some team members will be naturally better at this than others, right? But this is stuff that we would want to see us teaching teams. So so here's how it goes. We seem to not be listening to each other. So I've just stepped out of the conversation. It's gotten a little hot maybe. And I say, we seem to not be listening to each other. So I didn't say we are not listening. We seem to not be listening to each other. So that's what's happening. It's a kind of an assertion, and I want to provide some evidence. So Jan said something, and then John said something completely different. And then Jos said something yet again different, but no one referred to what the other said. So can you see how I've very clearly named the pattern, the pattern of interaction here, right? And I've given, some evidence or not evidence, I've given some illustrations so people can have a better sense of the texture of what I'm talking about. When this happens, I find myself getting really frustrated and confused, and my mind goes blank for a moment. So that's me sharing my experience, which is important information. What I make up is that each of you are trying to outsmart the other. So it's not a very kind story that I have. And I then check out and I stop engaging. And then finally, after saying this advocacy, I'm going to ask, so how do others see this? So I'm going to explicitly invite others to weigh in on this. Antoinette, I want to pin you. So do you want to, I feel like I want to just elaborate on this a little bit. What do you think? And you're on mute right now.
Thank you. I was coughing.
Mm.
Yes, so absolutely we can.
Mm.
So what Michael and I were talking about a little bit is what we do when we bystand is we take kind of a balcony view of the conversation, paying attention to the movement in the conversation. Okay. And a bystand in its purest sense is morally neutral. So if we look at what is happening, that is stated in a way that is hard to argue with. To me, it links with, the previous webinar, we spoke about sensing.
Mm-hmm.
So describing it in a way that it's hard to argue with. It's not loaded. In fact, the proper term is morally neutral.
Mm-hmm.
The next paragraph is a bystand on self, which is also really useful if it's stated as a morally neutral thing, so there's no blame, there's no attributing my reaction to something that you've done wrong. Okay. And the last sentence in that, we had quite a long discussion about that last sentence. Okay. Because that's not actually morally neutral. It's qualified by what I make up. And the more vulnerability there is in the group that's having the conversation, the more I am able to reveal what's going on for me, warts and all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it may, there's a moral bias there. Outsmarting is a slightly inflammatory term. If there's enough psychological support in the group and psychological challenge, then I'm able to report out completely without self-managing my my story.
Mm-hmm.
In a facilitator position, I'm probably not going to say that.
Yeah.
Okay, but certainly if I'm a participant in the conversation, which is where we want our teams to get to, we want our teams to get to being able to step in and out of this watching, being in the conversation versus watching the conversation role. Because in certain conversations, I might be really in it for whatever reason, and it's very hard for me to step out of the content. And somebody else needs to do it in another conversation. I might be the one that steps in and do that. So when we start talking about how able are we to bystand on a conversation, we immediately have to start looking at what level of, what's the holding environment, what level of psychological support there is. Because in our conversations, very often we'll find that it's hard to oppose. If we look at the structure of conversations, it's very hard to oppose under certain conditions. It could be a career limiting move, to just call a trivial example. Our bystand becomes disabled before our oppose. So if it's impossible to bring this bystanding to a conversation, there already is something amiss in terms of psychological support.
Yeah, so now Antoinette has just opened up a kind of can of worms here, which is, it's good to have cans of worms in 75-minute webinars, because then you have something to look forward to. How do we deal with this can of worms? But but the whole thing about the holding environment is so that, part of this work is helping teams develop for themselves a kind of holding environment, and it comes from developmental psychology, which is really we won't get into that here, but that's see, here's the thing, that if the nature of the environment, the collective environment that you're in, doesn't feel safe, the way to break the culture is that first monkey has to insist on going up that ladder. If no monkeys go up the ladder, no monkeys will go up the ladder. So as a human being, we need to start to make the kinds of moves we're inviting you to consider here, right? And you may not get as far down as what I make up. You might just articulate what's happening. You may not even say your experience. That might be a little too edgy, right? But you could certainly say, that we seem not to be listening to each other. Jan said something, and then John said something completely different. Then Yosset came in with something completely different, and no one referred to what the other said. You could certainly say that, and that right there would be like a lot. Okay. By the way, those of you who've been around me a lot know that and Antoinette, you've been around us, you know that we tend to be highly interactive. And my tendency often with these webinars is to open up to questions as we go along. And what I've seen happen time and again is that then the webinar goes off rails. And but we are going to have some time to hear questions and comments, but we want to take you through the full arc of what we're doing here so you can get the bigger picture. So forgive us for being rather hogging the space here. Okay, here's another example. And this example is giving someone feedback. And this is a little bit similar to the impact feedback that some of you may have learned in other courses elsewhere, but has a little bit of a different emphasis. So here's an example. So that's the third time you interrupted me. Earlier when I was talking about X, then a while ago when I was answering John's question, and then just now. Right, so I've articulated what's happening. I've provided some examples so that, and again, the utility of providing examples is partly to, so that it's inarguable, but also to make it so that it is arguable, that no assertion worth its salt is completely unassailable, right? And so I'm simply providing my way of making sense of this. So essentially what all I'm doing here is that I'm opening up, I'm being very open to my sense making about what's happening. And it invites other people's disconfirmation. Other people can come in and say, or they could even say something like, wow, I'm really sorry, or whatever, but let's continue on with this. So when this happens, I find myself getting tongue-tied. My mind goes blank for a moment. So what I make up is that you think I shouldn't bring up these kinds of issues. So then I shut down and I don't say anything, right? How do you see this? So this is like a one-on-one interaction with somebody. And so I'm explicitly inviting their coming into the conversation. And notice that I have made the conversation, I've made it transparent. I've brought transparency, which almost always has the effect of bringing transparency elsewhere. Do you want to add anything to this, Antoinette?
I just, my mind just always goes to how difficult it is for us to articulate even what's happening for us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's so easy. It's easy to articulate the preference or even an appreciation, but it's so hard to articulate my experience because a lot of the time we just don't know what it is.
Yeah.
So the slowing down, you know, and really getting in touch with the full impact.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
that happens there, and that also has to happen in order for there to be transparency, because generally we just want to, you know, continue with the conversation. So yeah, that's just where my mind went to.
Yeah. Well, see, an anti-pattern here is I could jump right to my experience. I could say, when you interrupt me, I find myself getting tongue-tied. My mind goes blank for a moment, right? So there's something missing in that as a communication. And that which is missing in that as a communication tends to leave people feeling more defensive. Because I haven't provided them a frame in which to be able to hold the report of my experience. And moreover, to your point about slowing it down, when I take the time to articulate what I see as happening, you know, and providing examples, it tends to slow things down, and it creates a space in which people can then hear maybe even a kind of plea, like, God, I get really tongue-tied. And it's painful for me, right? When that happens, because then I become really stupid, and that's not how I want to show up. Okay, I feel like I want to just open this up for some questions, because you're going to go into an activity where you can, you know, start to maybe play around with this a bit for yourself. So shall I stop sharing the slides for a moment, and so that we can just interact with you for a moment? I think so. Oh, all right, good to see you all. Good. So questions or, you know, comments on this. We'll come back to kind of a Q&A a little bit in just a little bit, but just, yeah, Olaf.
I had kind of 3 questions that I put in chat, and they don't need to be answered right now. But one that I was really curious about is when you had that circle of process and content, content diminishing and process being enlarged a little bit. I wonder if the tolerance of a group for that to happen diminishes as the group gets bigger. Like if there are 20 people in a meeting, it's much harder to try to focus on process than if there's maybe 3 or 4 people in a meeting, because maybe, you know, people feel like it's derailing the conversation. It's a really expensive meeting. It's like there's all these reasons why folks aren't maybe so tolerant of that.
Yeah, great. So this is the all right. So this is always a danger of introducing one element of a multi-element, you know, complex, you know, interaction of elements and interrelationship of elements, right? So but there's another element, you know, that calls for, and that element is called a designed alliance. You know, so I would never dream of beginning a meeting that is that expensive. And just to say a little bit of what a designed alliance is for those who haven't run into the term, a designed alliance is just setting creating a set of agreements that all of us as a collective will agree to in order to do the work that we're here to do, whether it's a meeting or a series of meetings or a training or whatever it is, right? So that's a designed alliance. And so I would never dream of starting something like that without a designed alliance. And as a facilitator, I'm going to put in, and from time to time, we need to pause to examine how we're working together, because my assertion is that the quality of what we produce, the results we produce, are going to be a product of how we're interacting and how we're conversing. And so from time to time, we're going to want to just pause for a moment. And I, as a facilitator, can take us through those moments. So that would be one way to sort of, you know, design for that concern, Olaf.
Yeah.
The other thing that also comes into play is very often you step into this exactly when you're stuck anyway.
Mhm. Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
so even if it's a big group,
Yeah.
it's I mean there's absolutely, I think, you know, underlying your question is the psychological support or psychological safety that's there in the group, which Michael's just addressed through Designed Alliance. But very often you step into this only when the group is stuck.
Mhm.
So
Yes,
it
that's
doesn't
right.
matter how big the group is. I mean, thank heaven somebody is coming with something that can get us unstuck. And it might come from left field, the fact that we look at the process, but people are used to a facilitator at least stepping into the role to, you know, get the conversation moving again.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so, you know, part of what we want to uh, uh, create during the Designed Alliance discussion is what do we want to do when we run into conflict? You know, we don't want to design for the occasion of conflict when we're in the heat of conflict. That you can't design when you're in the heat of conflict. But what you can do is you can say, so we created an agreement around what we're going to do around conflict. Let's just take a moment and look at that. And by the way, when you do that, that's another bystand. But it's a bystand that invites everyone to take a moment to bystand, to step outside of the heat of the moment in order to be able to think straight. So there's a whole set of elements, and we'll say something about an offer we're going to be doing in November. We're starting to put together a set of offers, you know, of various sizes and levels of involvement. And so we're going to do the first of one of these in November. Cool. Maybe a couple, maybe one or two other questions. What do you think, Antoinette, before going into the practice? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Cool. Please. Who's next?
Yeah, what's occurring to me is the power dynamics, you know, how your role plays into this, how the role of the people in the room play into this. All of those things kind of tie into this as well in my mind. You know, are you the facilitator versus aren't you the facilitator? You know, what is what is your perceived power in this conversation to do that kind of work or anything? And do we have the safety in the room to do that? You know?
Yeah. What are some ways that you have to be able to address that such that you're able to increase transparency and openness with the group?
I think part of it is like you're talking about the Designed Alliance, like helping them to, assume positive intent as an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
I might add to that also to just to again to speak the elephant that's in the room. You know, if I'm the senior leader in this meeting, you know, I want to address that. So you're going to perceive me as being in a place of power, and that I might, hold something against you. But so, you know, if I'm in that position, I'm going to need to be able to speak to that in a way that is convincing for people.
Yeah. And it has to be the person with that power doing that, kind of saying that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So as a facilitator, it's going to be harder for me to say that and be heard. It has to be them.
Yeah. There's a whole set of conversational practices, one of which is called framing. And framing is just basically saying what we need to understand about, you know, in order to have the conversation or series of conversations we're about to have. And part of that framing is roles. Like, you know, like I'm an executive leader, and my role here is at some point I'm going to be making some decisions, right? And I'm going to be wanting to get some input from you. Or I could say I'm here as the senior leader, and my role here is to really be part of our collaborative effort, and that decision making will be made collaboratively. So just like getting all those kinds of things out in the open. And again, this is the theme of transparency. The theme of this session today is transparency.
Yeah, decision-making authority, and kind of calling that out at the beginning of any conversation like that. Yep.
Exactly.
And I mean, your question also raises the practice of, if only the leader in the room is able to do this, follow this pattern. What needs to change in order for others that doesn't have the power of facilitation, although that's just process authority, or positional power. What needs to change for them to bring the same bystand? Because surely their experience of what's going on is as useful as anybody else's, and what they make up is part of collective wisdom.
Yeah,
I'm thinking like family dynamics, and I'm thinking about things like the history and the culture, obviously the organization of what people's experiences or perceived experiences is around making those kind of statements, right? So, calling that out as part of this bystand also could be useful.
Yeah. I mean, Cantor, who's the father of structural dynamics, used to say that if a conversation without bystands indicates a dysfunctional culture, So, and certainly having a dysfunctional culture impacts directly on collective sense making, the quality of the
cool.
sense making.
So Will has a question, and then I'm thinking after we interact with Will on his question, we'll move into the practice. We'll probably have to do a kind of short version because it's always a good idea to leave some time at the end for some just Q&A and discussion. It's hard to do this in 75 minutes, I'm telling you. Cool. Will, please.
So not a question, maybe just building on what Kenneth brought to the table. So if you don't have process authority or positional authority, and there is still difficulty in this space, another way that you could position this as a member of the group is to lead with vulnerability and courage by clarifying your intention in doing this and seeking common ground. So, for example, before I do the bystand, I can say, I'm thinking that we're all wanting to get to a mutual solution. And what I'm noticing is that you're providing a solution, you're providing a solution, you're providing a solution, and they all seem to be disconnected. And then you go to 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it clarifies that you're not there to oppose anybody's view, you're not criticizing, you're not being difficult, you're actually bringing common ground, creating common meaning, and you're clarifying your intention that you're trying to serve the larger purpose. So that's sometimes helpful if you feel that there's authority missing in the room for you to say that.
Yeah, cool. That's great, Will. And what you're referring to is framing. And so, we almost put framing in as a conversational act at the beginning. So and framing could be just as simple as, so I just want to provide an observation, what I'm noticing in how we're doing our work together. Is that okay? Can I do that? And so that's just like another version of what you're suggesting there. Yeah, great, cool. Right. How is this going? Just checking in with you. Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. We good? Yeah, good. It's always good. It's always good just to kind of pause and be witness to our experience together, because we are in an experience together, and this is a lot of, we're sharing a lot of information, and yet there's something to be said about kind of just turning our attention for the moment to witness that we are in an experience together here, collectively. Okay. Shall we go to the
Practice?
Yeah, let's go to the exercise. And so this is something that you could do. We'll give you a few minutes to do it here, but probably not a lot. But this is something, and I put those examples. I put a PDF file into the chat. So if you wanted to kind of use those examples to prompt yourself in this practice, you can do so. So, but this is certainly something you can do at home. And so think of a recent time when the conversation was unproductive, imagine that you could go back in time and bring this bystand pattern into the conversation using the prompts below. Write down what you might do. All right, so here are the prompts. And again, you may only get through 1 and 2. So it just really, it'll depend on the culture of your team, how much of that you can do. And so the spirit of this is an experiment to help you start to get a feel for what it might be like to engage conversationally in this way. So it can be really helpful. Chris Argyris, one of my teachers, has this practice where you write things down. He calls it left hand or left column, right column, where in one column you say, what you said, what the other person said, and then the other column you say what you were thinking. And so this kind of writing this kind of stuff down can help us get us in a mode where we can start to, bring these practices, into our conversation. So is it clear what we're asking you to do with these instructions? Anyone not clear about this? Okay, I'm going to assume that we're good. So Antoinette, I'm thinking let's do this for about 5 minutes. Not a lot of time, but enough to start to get your feet wet a little bit with this. So go ahead. And then we'll find out how it went afterwards. Oh, great. Thank you. So something to consider going forward. What possibilities for future action can you now imagine from this? And what I was saying when I was on mute was that you might want to consider continuing with this activity if you're finding it useful right after the session, so you can really get the benefit. Ordinarily in a workshop, you would have more time for this and you would practice this conversationally. So, and finally, we want to just tell you, actually, sorry. So let's just open it up for, we have time just for a couple of questions. And should I put the stuff up about the thing in November, Antoinette, or hold off?
It's so maybe we just want to hear without screen sharing so that people can see one another, Michael.
Yeah, great. Cool. Give us 1 minute at the very end to tell you what's next. Okay. So questions, like what is this? I guess we could just even ask the question, what does this make possible for you to look out from now?
For me, Michael, when you said that, I was thinking about what you were saying earlier, because as a facilitator, I could see this as an essential tool. And, I think we all experienced parts of this before. Mm-hmm. How to unlock that capability in others, so that someone had mentioned, I think it was you said, everyone ideally in the team should be able to step forward and be a bystander. Right. But I think part of the reason we're here is we're not seeing that, right? That's not something that's easy for people to do. So how do we encourage, train, enable others to do this is what's in my mind.
Yeah, it's great. It's so we're not going to address that question, except to say that that the curriculum that we're putting together around this stuff, the first part of the curriculum is, what are the basic practices? What are the basic distinctions here? And then the second, in this curriculum, the second sort of course or the second offering is, how do you coach and facilitate teams in developing these practices for themselves? And so the first one could be for, anybody on a team who's interested in getting better, right? That first, and we'll say more about it in just a moment. Whereas the second program is more targeted for facilitators and coaches who want to help their teams just get better at this. Just like as facilitators and coaches, we help teams get better at certain agile practices, certain engineering practices, and this is just another layer. And so there are certain techniques and ways to go about helping team members be able to develop this stuff. Is that useful, Todd?
It is. Thank you. I mean, I know it's not easy, right? So
Yeah,
yeah.
no, it's not. And this is really a big part of what we're up to in the center is, is we have a pretty good methodology for how to teach people to facilitate what we call deliberate sense-making practices. And so that's something that we're going to be doing a lot more of in 2023.
Nice.
Yeah. That's a great question. It's a legitimate and important question. We have time for maybe one or two, maybe even just one more, honestly. I just feel that Sarah wants to come in. I don't know why I get that feeling.
I don't necessarily have a question, but I just have an experience where I struggle the most with this work is taming my reptilian brain in the moment. In the framing piece, framing it so that it's resonates with people. I mean, and I know it, and then I'm analyzing situations all the time, knowing when is the right time to bring my, bring my perspective to the table. And, I guess those are kind of the things that I am doing lots of yoga and breathing, but those are the hard things for me.
I just really appreciate the spirit of the way that you're communicating that. So I experience you as having a lot of self-awareness and emotional intelligence, and consider joining us in some of the things that we're doing. This, I think, one thing to say. And the other thing is that sometimes you have to take some risks and to find out, what happens. Yeah. Cool. Great. Okay. Antoinette, do you think maybe just go ahead and share what's coming in November?
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah. And then we'll close with just a kind of a checkout. We just, just to hear from everybody what you're leaving the session with. We have it's a workshop coming up in November. Now, this may be bad news for some people. It's for a European audience, a November one. And we'll say more about that in just a moment. But the name of this is called "Growing Your Team's Problem Solving and Intelligence." And so it's kind of like the entry level. It's a kind of the gateway into this whole curriculum, and it's for anybody on a team, including a facilitator, including team members, whatever, who care about their problem solving intelligence, I guess, is that they notice that's lacking and would like to get better at creating conversational practices and interaction practices that improve problem solving. So we're offering the next one is November 9, 10, and 17. And they're 4.5 hours each of those 3 days. So it's not like a huge commitment, but we would go much, much deeper into stuff than we have today. We'll offer another one of these in mid-January, and we'll keep people abreast as to these dates. And then, so this is kind of like the first in the curriculum. And then the second workshop in the curriculum will probably happen sometime in January or early February. And again, we'll alert you to all of these things coming up.
And if I can just add something. So the idea is that the first 2 days, we do a lot of the practices and a little bit of, we share a lot of the practices and, some of the things behind it. And then you have a week to practice. So that you come back with already having applied some of it, with what's hard for you, what are you stumbling over, and then do more practice on that last day. So that's why it's designed to have a week in between.
Great. Cool. So let us know if you're interested or you think you might know people who would be interested. And then we'll, and again, we'll say, we'll get more details out soon. Okay, so, okay, we're at 5:15. Ooh, okay. All right, 1 minute. I'm leaving this session with, and then whatever you could say in a word or two. And then we'll pop off.
I'm leaving with renewed intention.
I'm centering on that phrase, morally neutral. It's an interesting one.
I'm leaving with understanding that I need to be the first monkey.
I'm leaving with a little more clarity.
I'm leaving thinking about moves and language.
I'm leaving with the dare to try.
I'm leaving with a broader understanding of framing.
I'm leaving with some gratitude and interest.
Yeah. And I'm leaving wishing we could be together longer. Just really, really enjoying you. Thank you for bringing, it's just a quality of warmth here. It's just really wonderful. Thank you. And it's good to see people, especially those like Todd, who I haven't seen in such a long time. It's really, really good to see you.
Mhm.
Give my best to our dear Sinead.
I will.
Yeah. Tell her I'm going to reach out to her soon, actually.
Okay. I will.
Give a warning. Okay. All right, everybody. So go out, have a great day, great weekend, whatever it is that's in front of you. And do this little bit of practice. I think you'll find that it actually will shift something for you. Cool. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You well.